Welcome to the Inside Story. I'm Billy Hallowell, and today we are going to be diving into an important topic. The Supreme Court recently heard a very important case surrounding the transgender issue. We will break that all down for you. I am joined today by John Brown from the Christian Post. How you doing?
Good, Billy. How are you?
I am doing well. Now, you had a very busy week. You actually spent some time at the Supreme Court on the day that this case was being heard. Now, people listening to the show today, they probably have varying degrees of knowledge about this case. It is complicated. And again, it is about the transgender battle that is ongoing. Tell us a little bit about this case. Help people understand what the Supreme Court was actually hearing.
Right. So the case is U.S. versus Skrmetti. It's a case that it emerged after Biden's DOJ sought an injunction against a law that Tennessee passed in 2023 that effectively banned puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for minors to treat them for gender dysphoria. They can be prescribed for other issues, but for gender dysphoria, the state wanted to ban it. So this suit was brought by three transgender teens and their families, as well as a Tennessee doctor. And there are 23 other states who have a similar law. So this court's decision in this case is going to have some wide-ranging consequences.
You know, there are two sides, and we'll get into both of these sides on this issue. I think the critics of Tennessee are going to say, well, what was Tennessee's reasoning? Why did they pursue this ban on these procedures? And how would you respond to that from their perspective, helping people understand Tennessee's position on this?
Well, I think a lot of these states are having to come to terms with the fact that a lot of these kids are they regret going on having these procedures because there are long-term health problems that we're discovering in terms of bone density and sterilization and also there's just also the legal and moral issue of can a child really consent to doing something to his body that will affect him for the rest of his life. So I think that's ultimately what is of concern here.
Yeah, and anybody who has done reporting on this, including myself, we've interacted with, talked to people who do have those regrets, right? They were young, maybe even they were adults when they started the process, but we're talking here specifically about children, under the age of 18, let's say, who they start this process, they're not developed enough mentally to know what exactly they're getting into based on the feelings that they're currently having, and they later come to regret that. And so that is what is at the core, I think, of a lot of this when it comes to Tennessee's position and other people who have said, wait, I don't know that this is appropriate for children to be undergoing. Now, the attorneys challenging the Tennessee law, what did they argue? What were they saying in this hearing before the court?
Well, the person who argued first was actually the Solicitor General of the U.S., Elizabeth Prelogar, and so she's the fourth most powerful person in the DOJ. And the DOJ's argument is that basically the Tennessee law is an example of sex discrimination. They're arguing that this law allows puberty blockers and hormones for reasons unrelated to transgender issues. And so they say that, the patient's sex becomes the determining factor in deciding whether they can have these treatments. So, but then also the Tennessee Solicitor General, he argued on the other side that the law was based on medical purpose rather than the basis of sex, and so it wasn't discriminatory. And he also argued that the plaintiffs were conflating procedures and that they were fundamentally different, as puberty blockers can be used for reasons outside of gender reassignment.
Yeah, I mean, this is there's so many layers here, but I know this is always dangerous, but I'm going to ask you because we don't really know, but based on what we heard, which direction do some experts believe the justices are appearing to sway on this? Because again, it's going to be a little while probably before we have a decision. What did it seem they were thinking?
Well, if I had to guess, I'd say the typically conservative justices will be siding with Tennessee and the usually liberal ones with the DOJ, but it's hard to know. I noticed Kagan remained pretty quiet most of the time, but Jackson and Sotomayor went viral for some of the questions that they asked. And at one point, Jackson seemed to compare the Tennessee law to banning interracial marriage, and then Sotomayor compared these transgender treatments to taking Advil, and they just got wrecked on social media over that. But one of the things I remember most is Alito. He had one of the most memorable exchanges. He actually pressed Chase Strangio, who was the first trans identifying attorney to ever argue before them about whether gender identity is immutable, which would be a crucial, that would you would need to prove that if you're saying that this is discrimination. And Alito observed that it's simply a fact that people's gender identity changes, which he noted would suggest that that proves it's not immutable by definition. So that was something that really stood out to me.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see where they end up falling. But one of the things that is interesting, is that the UK and other places in the world where this issue, they're a little bit further ahead of us, let's say, on this issue. They have released data, information, studies that seem to say, hey, we need to pull back on this when it comes to children. Hey, we don't have evidence that this is working. We've seen a number of those studies in the past year. Was anything said about that by the justices here in America as they're weighing how to handle this issue here?
Yeah, I remember Alito and Kavanaugh in particular brought up the studies in Europe, especially in England, Sweden, Finland. I remember Kavanaugh said that these countries have basically pumped the brakes, is the phrase he used, on these procedures for minors, and he was reticent to suggest that the United States should be an outlier in that sort of thing. And they also cited the Cass report multiple times, which of course the UK used to ban these things for minors over there, um, unless they're in a clinical trial. Um, but the DOJ argued that these countries haven't outright banned these procedures, and they claim that these experts believe these procedures can be medically necessary. So I guess there's a disagreement on what these studies even show, which is makes it difficult to even talk about it.
Well, which is an interesting posture because I haven't read every bit of the Cass report and all of these studies in their entirety because there's a lot of research that's being done. But the reality is these countries pulled back substantially on what they were offering, right? So the idea that if something's working, that you're just going to immediately pull back on it, there's clearly questions. I think at the very least we could say, and correct me if you think I'm wrong on this, there are severe questions, major questions that made people do a double take in some of these countries about how they were handling this issue with children. Would that be accurate?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So, okay, you spoke with people outside the court and really interesting dialogue, and we're going to link out to the story so people can read some of that. But what most struck you about the reactions from the people outside the court who you were interviewing and speaking with?
Well, there were these two big dueling rallies outside the court. They were both competing for who could be the loudest, it seemed. But one of these rallies was put on by the advocacy group Do No Harm, which is opposed to these things for minors. Some of the featured speakers were Matt Walsh, Chloe Cole, famous detransitioner, who's been speaking out against this stuff. And everyone remained peaceful, but I also saw a lot of anger on the other side. When some of the people supporting the Tennessee law were speaking, people tried to shout them down. So yeah, emotions were very high, but I was glad to see that nobody did anything crazy, like when Kavanaugh was confirmed. I don't know if you remember when all that happened, but no
Yeah.
one climbed on any statues this time.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I think is interesting on this issue, and we've seen this in Brennan Showalter's Generation Indoctrination show, we've seen it in dialogue. You saw it outside the court. You have some liberals who are weighing in, and they're actually siding with conservatives and Christians on this issue. Even some atheists who are doing that. Can you explain why you think that is? Because that is a fascinating dynamic.
Yeah, most of the people I spoke to opposing this stuff were liberals. There was one woman in particular. She worked in the foster care system in California. She actually filed an amicus brief in the case, and she said that she believes gender dysphoria emerges from other mental health issues, and that parents are just using this trans label to dismiss those deeper problems. I guess because it's easier, or I'm not sure. But she's also concerned, having been in that system, that would-be foster parents won't be able to participate in the system unless they affirm transgenderism, which I think is actually the case in California already. And then I also spoke to another woman. She, described herself as a lesbian, but she thinks that all of this stuff that they're doing to kids is homophobic. And one thing she said people are under the misconception that this is a right wing conservative issue and that it's anti-trans. And she said, no, this is an issue that transcends the typical left right politics that we're used to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's an issue that obviously maybe swayed some hearts and minds in this last election. And I think it's going to continue to be a major issue, and we'll have to see where the court falls on all of this. John, we'll have you back when that time comes. Appreciate you joining us today.
Great. Thanks, Billy.
Everyone else, make sure you tune in next week for another episode of The Inside Story. In the meantime, head on over to the Christian Post for all the news you need to read, and we will see you back here again next week.